We need to be real about what has actually changed for women in the last 10 years in the region. I am gonna want some tea.
I'll just pour some for
But
you.
you're so comfy.
No, I can pour.
Okay, because I feel like if I move, I'll never find this sweet spot again, ever.
Well, you are the sweet spot.
I need to stay here. Welcome to another episode of Sage Takes Time.
I'm Elissa.
I'm Amira, and we're going to talk about
What are we
representation.
Does it even matter?
Yes.
Does anything we do even matter and make a difference?
Yeah, we're going to try to look back. Womena has been around for 10 years. We're not going to look back at Womena per se, but given the nature of the content we do and the storytelling that we focus on, we're going to try to figure out if things have gotten better generally for women in the region, or are they the same or worse?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Stay tuned. Could go either way.
We actually don't know yet. We're probably going to have more questions than answers, which is okay. I think it's important to think about things in retrospect and look at like big picture. Okay, so short answer.
Yeah.
I'm just going to get right into it.
Get
Maybe we
right
work
into
like
it.
backwards.
Sure.
I don't think representation only is enough. It's become more evident in the last year that just having women in certain positions of power or women of color or people of color, diversity in certain industries or on an important higher like stakeholder level, it's not enough. And just showing women's stories and like bringing their issues to light, it's not enough. There needs to be a lot more than that.
It's just one part of the equation.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's enough because it's what I do for a living. But I also wonder if it's the very long way of getting there.
Yeah.
Because if you're reframing and redefining what people are in other people's minds or in their own minds, that takes a long time. Just creating new neural pathways and reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing those ideas takes a really long time. So I also don't think that we can judge just based on 10 years if the representation has made a dent or not. Like, I think this takes at least a full generation to come of age, or 2 generations to really see the effects of representation.
I agree with that. And that's not to say that all of those things don't matter and they're like unimportant. No, like it is important to have representation and diversity in media, in storytelling, in positions of power, in business, in whatever. That it is important. It's vital. Like you can't progress without it. But I think there was this notion previously that we used to say like lightly or jokingly that if women ruled the world would be a much better place, or we wouldn't go to wars. The problems that we deal with would be, as a society, like globally, would be mitigated somehow.
Yeah.
But
I agree with that.
You agree with that?
Totally.
That if women ruled the world, it would be a better place?
Absolutely. And yeah, there could be sociopathic, crazy women that make crazy decisions, but I think across the board, you'd have a much more complex approach to solving issues.
But that's if those women are working with the perspective or within a mindset of like a matriarchal society.
Yeah, the system itself has to be different.
It brings, sure.
Right.
But that's exactly my issue with representation. Just representation now on a superficial level is being used and weaponized or manipulated to create a sense of diversity and equality when actually a lot of people that we didn't used to see in positions of power are now there, but they're just forwarding the agendas of very like capitalistic colonial approaches to the world and like perspectives on the world. And we saw that even more this past year, especially with like Palestine. And we saw people, women, like Black women sitting in the UN repeatedly raising their hand to like veto a proposition that would bring like a ceasefire, for example. And that, to me, the first couple of times I saw it was shocking, and it was so sad because it's like we're being pitted against each other. So then it made me question this idea of like, we shouldn't just rely on only representation. That is not going to solve the problem. It's kind of like, is it feminism or is it intersectional feminism?
Right.
It's what mind and approach and thinking are you bringing to the table
Yeah, but it's one of those approaches where if we all agree that the system as it is really messed up and the system has to change, you cannot change the system just through grassroots organizations. You need to get the right people in positions of power and enough of them in positions of power to shift the system.
Sure, but I don't think they're binary. It's not either grassroots or positions of power. That's not the...
No, it's both.
Yeah, but I'm not like debating that as like a binary, like dichotomy or whatever. Sure, you have to have both. But once you get people in the position of power, what are the right people? How do you get the right people in the position of power?
For real, I don't think that you can actually get to the top of things in this system without playing by those rules and being corrupted along the way. Like, you cannot win in a capitalist system by being a good person. You cannot win in a political system as they are now without taking lobbying money or being corrupt in some way, shape, or form. And that's the only way that you can even win and have access to those areas. You know what I mean? So whoever gets there, whatever they look like, is going to have problematic behavioral patterns and relationships that are going to just end up trickling down and hurting the people that are at the bottom.
Yeah, so
that sounds pretty depressing, Amira.
Sorry, guys.
But then
it's just real. Like, if we're being reflective and introspective or retrospective or all the above.
All the spectives.
All the spectives. We need to be real about like what has actually changed for women in the last 10 years in the region. And the last 10 years, we're at that as like a timeline, is just because Womena's been around for 10 years. Actually, the idea of this episode was to look at like the silver lining. What are some things that have changed for the better?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that the biggest change for me is the breadth of that representation. Like when I started, now 11 years ago, when I really started, there just was not regional representation of women with success stories that we could, as individuals, as young professionals, measure ourselves against or aim towards emulating. You know, like that just wasn't the case. Like our role models were, well, at least my role models were very much Western figureheads. And maybe if I read in National Geographic about, you know, what's her name, Rebecca Lolonsoli, the woman from the Umoja tribe in Kenya, like that became a role model for me because it was slightly closer to the territory that I was currently operating in. But I didn't see those figureheads. And now I feel like we've built an archive of hundreds and thousands of potential role models that we did not have, that younger versions of us will be able to look to and be inspired by. And, you know, that gives more hope overall. Like there's more hope now for change than there was at the time on like a broad level. Simultaneously, though, I've become more jaded and more hopeless. But that's where...
Why? Because you made it sound great.
No, I made it sound great, but that's where I think there's like more hope in the minds and the hearts of younger people entering the real world than there was when I was that age. But at my age, with the experience that I have and the exposure to the conversations that I've been exposed to of that previous generation, like I became really jaded and I really lost hope in the ability for individuals to, especially these grassroots organizations, to create change at the top levels. And Lebanon is a great example for that. Like the amount of hope that there was in the Lebanese revolution of 2019, there was so much hope, and you literally had a quarter of the country on the streets, like a quarter of the local population advocating and fighting and protesting for change, right? And nobody on the top cared, and nothing came of that. And I feel like a lot of Egyptians told us, or at least told me when I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. They're like, guys, we've been through this. Like, watch what's going to happen and just be cautious.
I remember on a phone call, I was like really wanting to protect your expectations versus reality.
Yeah.
And not to be pessimistic, because you never know, things could be different for in that specific circumstance, but being like, just go into it knowing that it takes a lot and a very, very long time for things to actually change.
Yeah.
But it was an important moment.
It was an important cultural moment, but everything that like subsequently followed, I think like beat us down and our hope down and our jadedness down. Like nothing, as horrific as it was, right? The biggest peacetime bomb in the history of mankind happening literally in the center of town. Like nothing was making these men in power shift, no matter how much their people were starving or thirsty or in pain or in lack of housing or electricity or basic respect, services, safety, security, you know, they didn't care. And they would rather rule over rubble. And that for me is this like deeply heartbreaking reality that I haven't been able to shake. But what's wild is that there's constantly new generations of younger people who don't have that jadedness, who weren't as active and, you know, front-facing towards the heartbreak. That's where the impact really happens. And as, you know, Charlie Chaplin said, as long as dictators die, then liberty will never perish, you know, and that's the reality, is that there always will be the opportunity for that. It's just...
There is the opportunity. I think I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just think that if we bring it back to like the idea of the status of women, let's say in the region.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it has gotten better simply? And why? Yes or no?
Yes.
What do you think has gotten better?
Well, I think the amount of women in leadership positions has gotten better. Like statistically, that's gone up. Predominantly, in my experience, led by the UAE, who had about 80% of public servants coming that were women, and more women graduating from universities. And they were really promoting these statistics and kind of raising the bar for other countries in the GCC and the Khalij to follow suit.
Yeah.
And because it was seen more, talked about more, promoted more, you had more women than ever believing that they could enter those spaces that they otherwise would have been pushed away from. I think that
But don't you think
better.
We sometimes get so stuck on the fact that, like, for example, there has never been a female US president.
Yeah.
Like, who the fuck cares? You know, like we get a bit stuck on this idea and, you know, like as if once the first female US president comes, then suddenly the US is not going to be a fucking like colonial imperialist industrial complex.
No,
you know,
you're totally right.
That's not, and we've seen like the first Black woman of color, whatever, mixed ethnicity, female vice president. And she's probably, I think, one of the most irrelevant like senior administration officials in US history.
Yeah,
like,
totally there just for the image
for
of
representation.
It. For representation purposes, performative representation, right? Yeah. But this is where I think that veil has been lifted also.
Right, exactly.
Okay,
so now what?
So okay, I'll come all the way around and I'm on your side now.
No, I'll say also, that's not to say that I don't think things have slightly improved. To be super realistic and just to be real, a slight improvement over a decade is the best we can hope for. But we should consistently fight for more than that.
Yeah.
Because when you fight to move 10 steps forward, realistically, you're maybe going to get 2 steps forward. Mm-hmm. And maybe then someone will bring you 1 step back. But that's the fight for change that happens over time, where the jadedness comes in when you're older, because you will have seen that happen over a few decades. I don't know if it's jadedness or realism. So you need a little bit of that, and you need the idealistic, hopeful aspirations of the younger generations that hasn't experienced that bitter reality yet. And they both need to be constantly working together. That was a really long intro to what I think has changed. But one of the things is the fact that there's a much more open space now, especially online, for female-led storytelling. So we're one of those platforms that I think has been a very positive space for women. I also think a platform like Mother Being, which really opened up, blew wide open, the conversation around women's sexual and reproductive health. Really having conversations that even for us as Womena, we were a bit, to be honest, too scared to have on our platform because we didn't feel like anyone else was talking about it. And also, to be real, like there are things, given where we're based and where our teams are, there are things that we can't always talk about at the time that we want or in the way that we want.
Yeah.
And that's a choice that we make because in a strategic way, we want to be around because we believe that it's important to remain. And our editorial approach is a bit different than other platforms that take a more like head-on confrontational approach. That's important, but this is also important. So,
but you're saying like, if you really look back, remember in 2020, we did like a landscape of the global media sphere and how many platforms were talking about the things we were talking about or to the women's community, whether it was regional or global. At least half of those platforms that we found at that time are now closed.
They were like abroad.
Others, abroad, but they closed down. So even though there's Mother Being and there's Moj and there's the Slow Factory and there's dozens of pages on Instagram that are dedicated to feminism and the feminist approach, there's very few entities that come and that stay and that are able to withstand the constant like pushback that happens from the world, And I think it's not just this like frustration or jadedness, but there's also a fatigue that comes from it.
No, and also a lot of these places that you mentioned are media platforms that had a very difficult time monetizing, and they're we had a whole episode about the reality of sustaining a media platform and a media company over a long period of time, the financial realities of that. So a lot of them buckled under that pressure and they were maybe VC backed and failed to grow at the exponential rate that equity funding requires you to unrealistically grow. So that's also another side.
Now it's more like individuals with a Canva subscription who are able to actually put out the content of their own. But the region
now, there is a lot of conversation in a very comfortable way that was not the case previous to like 2019. It was very difficult to talk about sexual health and reproductive health and periods or sexual pleasure or all of these types of things for women in the region until a few brave souls started doing it, and also in a very strategic way and addressing that audience and growing that audience. And then that audience became like the protective layer. So it legitimized it even more and it was accepted and normalized even more. But if someone hadn't started doing that, these would have still been considered taboo topics. And we used to talk about them, but in a much more careful way. Whereas now, because there's a few of these platforms, we can all talk about it in a much more open way. So that's a very positive change because it's not something that existed before. It's a very important thing to consider.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's going to go away. And that subject has been opened and we all can talk about it.
We're all part of that dialogue. It makes me think of like when Me Too came out in 2016. There was a type of conversation online that was happening. Words were being used. People were saying things, even very traumatic experiences that they had had in a way that had never been done in a wide public forum before from so many voices. It wasn't an isolated case that made it to Oprah. It was a full blanket call out type of dialogue, which now it has been normalized 8 years later. And in the Middle East, we were a little bit late to have our own resurgence of our own Me Too movement, even though people had been fighting for rights and protections for women under law, especially with acts of violence in that way.
Yeah.
Now that dialogue has been opened in the region as well. And there's much more shock and dismay and call outs and like more of this cancel culture for our regional efforts. Ups and downs.
It ebbs and flows. Yeah. And there was like a wave that came a few years after the global one. And there was a wave of like a lot of women sharing their stories on different platforms, anonymously, not anonymously. There were court cases. There was like a lot of development there. There was a time where call out culture and cancel culture was really like prevalent. And now I would say it has died down a bit. And there's a lot of like questioning of the tools that were used, tools like calling people out and canceling people, because that's kind of, it was seen as the only tools at your disposal because you didn't have like the legal, judicial backing and support to actually take further action against like the someone that you accuse. And also people that did that, women that did that were faced with different kinds of risks. So they were also not protected as victims or survivors that were like speaking out and trying to like try these in more official like courts of law or whatever. So then cancel culture, call out culture became the tools that people were trying to find as an alternative to other official channels. But I would say that there's a lot of questioning now in like closed circles of women speaking about whether that is beneficial. Was it useful? Is it the only way? What else can we do? Like what good came out of it? So, which is not a bad conversation to have, but you're right. Like there was that wave, and that was an important wave as well because it opened the conversation around consent, around what's acceptable, around, you know, women having more agency of what they want. So there is a more awareness around that. Not to say that that has made things suddenly better, but at least we are having those conversations.
Yeah, at the very least. But to give a great example actually of like these 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I remember there being an account, and I can't remember the name, specifically focused on like the Egyptian Me Too
Assault police
movement. Assault police. Oh my God, what a legend.
Yeah.
So this really felt like if it was in a different context, it would have been a mob mentality type of like attack on individuals taken in the hands of the people. But because there wasn't necessarily the, as you said, the legal framework, the popularity of assault police, and just to like give context on what it was an individual who, when there was a case, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But when there was like an allegation of something having happened to a young woman by a certain guy, she collected the evidence directly and published it. And then more voices and more voices and more voices, more victims from this person. That's how it started, right? One guy, one victim.
Yeah, it started with a lot of allegations and stories around one guy. For the beginning, she was just on her own, I think, and then it developed into like more of a team.
Yeah.
For a couple of years, there was a lot of stories coming out. I mean, there was one big case that made it eventually into court and whatever, but then there were other stories around it that came after. But you have to also take note that like that page and that team and whatever does not exist anymore. And you have to question why.
Why?
Yeah.
So I remember there being pushback on like potential defamation from the alleged abuser. And
well, there have been
the safety of the people running the account. So it's something that was taken very seriously, even though there was more than enough evidence to take action against a potentially dangerous member of the public, right?
Yeah. I think there was this like space where there were a lot of stories being told and a lot of people sharing, which was very, very important. And then realizing that the channels to take those things forward were limited and were very risky, it made people like recoil backwards a bit. So for example, a page like that closed down eventually. There's another page called Speak Up, which I think is still open and still continues to do some of that work. And now there are a bit more. There was like a website also where people could submit stories anonymously. They were presenting maybe like chats where they were being blackmailed or threatened, which is
or voice notes.
It is a cyber crime. And that's one area of improvement that I can say also in Egypt, at least as far as I know, like the cyber crime law has improved, where if you're like threatening someone to like release pictures that they sent or release voice notes or whatever, especially women where there was like an intimate relationship maybe and you're blackmailing someone, there is now a cyber crime law that's a bit more robust than it ever has been in that space to protect women more so that you can complain and action can be taken a little bit faster than it used to.
Similar in the UAE, by the way.
It's a cyber crime law.
Right.
It's not a sexual assault or it's not a law to protect women. Yes. Like it's not addressing the core issue. You have to find like the workaround. You were saying that's what it's like in the UAE.
Saying that's what it's like in the UAE. There's a lot of laws that protect people from cyberbullying or even verbal assault, and you can go to court with proof of WhatsApp message assault. That's a thing, right? That's like a thing that's put in place that's protected, but it's not necessarily gendered. As in, like, the law was not put in place to protect women. And I think that a lot of the laws that we see that still hold women back are, usually like defended because they're defended for the betterment of the wider population. And what does that really mean, right? Like we can't put in a law that specifically protects women because the reason the laws are like this is because they protect everyone, even if they're women or not.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the laws in the region that are problematic, particularly for women, are what are called family laws. قوانين الأحوال الشخصية, basically things that regulate like divorce, custody, guardianship over children, things like that. That if you unpack the laws and what it means, you can see how much it can affect women's lives. For example, I'll also again speak about Egypt because that's what I know more. You don't, as a woman, as a mother, you don't actually have like full guardianship over your children. And this is part of the civil status law that has been under debate for years now, for like at least the past 5 years. So what that means is if your husband passes away and you become a widow, or if you get divorced, you don't have free movement to like go to your kid's school, ask for their file to move them to another school. If that happens, if the father is not present, either the father can do that. If they're not present, then the next of kin is the uncle. So the father's brother or the grandfather from the paternal side. It's not you as the mother.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a law that puts women at risk and makes them very vulnerable and actually controls their movement and their future and their family building when the husband or the father is either she's divorced him or has passed away. So this is very problematic, and there are a lot of laws that are like that have not yet changed. But what has changed, which is like more back to like the more hopeful kind of improvement progress side, is that there's a lot more storytelling in the entertainment space. So like musalsalat and aflam, yani films and Ramadan series, especially Ramadan because they know everyone is watching, where those stories are being centered a lot more in the last masalan 5 to 7 years than they have been before.
Yeah.
And there are a few notable female and male actually directors, like Mariam Naoum, Mariam Abaouf, and Karim al-Shinawi are like 3 young directors that are really focused on that kind of storytelling that I would say it's very aligned with the Womena way of storytelling. It's like very impact driven, and it talks about like the nuances of social issues and how they affect women particularly.
Those are the themes around the content that they make and the stories that they tell.
And there's been a lot more of that in the recent few years, like I was saying, particularly when it comes to Ramadan series.
Wasn't there one that you told me about, like, I can't remember how many years ago, maybe 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And it would cause such a stir. And the woman was like fighting for her kids' custody and she was trying to get like, she was literally in the court talking to the guy. I remember this like scene that everyone was talking about that was so scandalous that had just caused such a stir.
There was one musalsal, like a Ramadan series called تحت الوصاية, which was starring Mona Zaki. And it also really helps to have a strong female lead that people they have an affinity to because it's a little bit easier to digest that messaging. Also celebrities, actors that tend to take up those roles are like Mona Zaki, Nelly Karim, Hind Sabri. Like there's a few also ones that are, you will find them in those roles more and more. And it was about, Al-Wasaya is guardianship.
Okay.
So it was in even the title of the show. And it discussed exactly that, where her husband, she's widowed. All she's trying to do is gain full guardianship over her son and daughter, whatever, her kids. And all the ways in which, because she doesn't have that, she's being manipulated and controlled by the grandfather and the uncle and the finances. And she has to like run away and try to make do, and all the vulnerabilities that she risks because of this one thing that you would think would be so intuitive. Yani, there are 2 parents. If the father passes away, and then the mother is there, or vice versa. You wouldn't think that as a mother, you don't actually have guardianship over your kids. So this is like one thing that is being debated right now, and it's been a few years. But on the other hand, there's other issues like masalan sexual harassment.
Right. Actually, sexual harassment is a great like topic I think has really advanced, not just the dialogue happening publicly, but for example, in Lebanon, in Tunisia, 10 years ago, there were still laws that allowed for the abuser to potentially marry the victim and therefore legitimize the act
of rape.
So there were literally laws that protected abusers and were coming from my understanding of like this family honor, where if a female victim goes against the abuser, speaks up, right, and admits to what happened to her, her honor, the family's honor is gone. And that can be saved only by the abuser choosing to marry the victim. And the victim has no say in that decision. And so very often families would rather their daughter marry their abuser in order to save face, right, under the cultural kind of zeitgeist. And again, the victim had no actual say in this situation. It was all kind of the system working against them. And those laws in Lebanon, in Tunisia, only changed very recently. And that was shocking to me. You know, like you feel that these things sound archaic. These things just, they don't even sound intuitive. They don't even like make sense.
Like you don't think we should be fighting this battle right
now?
No,
dude, this is a thing that should have been like dealt with 200 years ago. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? How can a culture have dialogues that are so advanced in some ways and then so backwards in others? And how can there still be questions of like, you know, honor killings and whether or not those things are legitimate in a country like Lebanon that is also seen as one of the most progressive countries where still in mountain villages, small towns, like people do those things. Like for me, that was like huge progress. But then at the same time, people make excuses for the continued like acceptance of like backwards thinking because it's like a cultural tradition, right? But that is a big shift that happened legally. Like for us, and it's a huge win. At the same time, there's still more to go, you know? And I feel like there's always still more to pick on, more to complain. It's still so imbalanced compared to what we're getting. And I think that's where like the constant frustration comes in.
I think on the note of sexual harassment, it's important also, and it takes us to the importance of like words, language, storytelling. For example, in Egypt, the Arabic word for sexual harassment used to be on the street, used to be like mu'aksa. And then ana aksik it's harmless way of like kind of flirting almost. Or like it's kind of cute. And انتي حد عكسك في الشارع.
Okay.
As if you're passing by. And
someone like approaches you.
Yeah, it's more like a flirty, like the word itself did not carry the true essence of what was actually happening on the street to women. And it took years of campaigning by a lot of different groups and women's groups and a lot of media around it and a lot of like societal discourse to accurately describe what was happening and take it from mu'aksa to taharrush, which is the actual word for harassment.
Right.
You know? And that in itself, it's an important shift. Does it fix the problem? Not fully, but at least we're talking about things accurately. And I think that's where the role of storytelling platforms and content can have a really, really big hand in at least like defining what it is we're talking about, using the right language, at least
creating
as a first
words,
step,
even
creating words and pushing for more accurate descriptions of what's actually going on.
Yeah.
At least as a first step or as a first like few steps.
But I feel like that's the only weapon in our arsenal, if I'm being honest, because in the world as a whole, in countries that have free speech and the right to protest and things like that, the change doesn't necessarily happen just because people are protesting for it. And that's very similar in our region. And whether a country has freedom of speech or has the right to protest and to gather doesn't necessarily make a difference as to whether the change is going to happen. So I kind of feel like, especially in our region, the main tool that we have is the storytelling. Because once something becomes normalized, once the word is created, once it's introduced into common everyday vernacular, that's how the culture changes. That's how traditions start breaking and people start realizing that this isn't okay. And we tell more stories about how custody battles can be disruptive to families, or we tell more stories about the fact that, you know, the passports I got right now, like I can't, if I have kids, I can't pass on the citizenship that I carry to my children without my husband being from that exact culture with that same citizenship. Like that's mind-boggling to me, even though a man in my situation from the same culture doesn't have a problem and doesn't need to marry a woman from the same citizenship. And if we don't talk about that issue, if we don't bring it up and tell those stories in a way that hits people's hearts, specifically those in power and the hearts of the people around them who are going to influence you know, their way of thinking. Like, I can't see how change can happen, right? Like, for me, storytelling is not just like representation is not enough, like we were saying at the beginning, and it's like just one part of the equation. I really do think that it's not just representation, but the actual storytelling, movies, podcasts, conversations that get into the ears of those people, once it becomes part of the normal discourse, is what's going to lead to some sort of change. What else do we have?
But as we've seen, not just in the region, globally, without the political will, without the people in power feeling, for whatever reason, they need to also address this issue and make a change, you're not going to get very far. And so storytelling is important, advocacy and like grassroots kind of movements are important, but they always face this wall until someone says, for whatever reason, now is the time to make this change.
I'm thinking as you're talking that maybe the core of it, that you got the grassroots, you've got the storytelling, and then that last little piece of the puzzle that really, unfortunately, makes a big difference is making an economic case for it. Women in the workplace was only widely accepted because GDPs need to grow, because they need more spending power.
But it was also a side effect of going to war. So it's not like a great...
But not across the board for every country.
Not across the board, but I would say what really pushed it forward was this moment where like the men in power have created a world war. And so the men are at war. And now, okay, women can suddenly like, okay, now it's okay for you to work.
Yeah, because the GDP still has to grow, right? So then does that mean that we should look in the future towards integrating women's power economically?
You're completely right. And a lot of work the advocacy groups do, and like rights groups and researchers and like lawmakers that are trying to affect the actual decisions, make those cases. Like they make the economic case, they make the social cases. I want to say that we're acknowledging that there have been positive changes, and we're focusing on the region, not as a comparison to the West, but just because we're focusing on the region. The West is a shit show right now, and we're going to talk about that in another episode. That should not be our benchmark. It should never have been a benchmark. And now, thank God, we see that like we should not use it as a reference point for progress or whatever. But there have been some positive changes in the region. There's a lot more work to be done, as with everything.
And for me, as a main takeaway, that even in places that preach progress, the minds of the population aren't necessarily aligned with the laws that are there to protect. And that's still, again, for me, the most important thing. Because behind every law, behind every government, behind every story, there's a person. Yeah. And I really deeply, deeply believe the main work that we can do, that I choose to do, is to pull on the heartstrings of those people and have them recognize like the humanity in others. I've said that in so many episodes. And I think that that's just like the only way that women's advancement is going to go anywhere, is when those shifts start happening, that we can just really, like, the stories are being told. I'm not looking at you and I'm seeing these superficial stories that other people tell me. I'm seeing the true person behind those beautiful eyes of yours.
Cute, the unexpected, that threw me off.
Just goes to show that like you could be all feminist as you want, but if I say you're so pretty today, you're like, oh, thank you.
No, it's sweet. Khalas, I'm all talked out. Thank you. Do you have anything you want to add?
I just want to find hope again.
Was this not a hopeful episode?
It
was like real talk.
It's real talk. I think I just always, my perspective now sees more darkness than it does light in the system. But when I look at the people, I have more hope. I'm more optimistic when I really break down that behind all of this, there's just a person. I have more hope because a person is much easier to reach and to change than an idea or a belief or a law.
Yeah.
I hope you guys enjoyed that episode of Sage Takes Time, an exploration of are things better or worse? What was the progress made in the last 10 years?
Yeah.
And
do you think things are better or worse or the same? Or do you care at all to change things with us.
Yeah, what amazing change has happened in
Yeah.
your country? Let us know in the comments down below.
Comment, like, subscribe, share with your friends, subscribe to Womena on YouTube, follow us on Instagram at Womena, and share it with your feminist friends or your non-feminist friends.
Thanks.